Hello and welcome to the Rays of Hope program brought to you by the Purchase Area Sexual Assault and Child Advocacy Center. I'm your host today, Mary Foley, and I'm so glad that you've joined us for another edition of the program. Usually when I come to you, we talk about sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and we interface with community partners that you know very well, social services and law enforcement and other direct service providers. But today we're going to be talking with a very important member of our community that represents probably one of the most important roles our community interfaces with every day, and that's the faith-based community, a pastor. And I'd like to welcome to the program Dr. Nathan Joyce from Heartland Worship Center.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. You and I have had a little bit of opportunity to talk together over the past few months, just really developed a new relationship in terms of helping victims in our area. And I have understood more and more the importance of the role of pastors in helping our people heal. And so today we're going to be talking about a very sensitive topic, but I don't know that I have ever, on this program anyway, talked about it from a spiritual perspective and the effect of sexual abuse and sexual assault on spirituality. So thank you for helping us have this conversation. Would you just introduce yourself to the viewer and tell us what you do and how long you've been here and what you bring to us today?
My name is Nathan Joyce. I'm the senior pastor at Heartland Worship Center, and been here about 3 years. Actually was born in Paducah and born in Western Baptist Hospital, moved away for a while, but so this is hometown to me. Heartland is a church. We've really strived to be a church that meets the needs of people in our community. We have a message, but we want to have evidence of that message in our actions. And so part of that is meeting people in their tragedies and in their pain. It's a place where redemption is very ripe and very fertile, actually. And so, but I have a background in counseling and in my education background, and so became aware of these issues through both as a pastor and an education setting.
Well, and I think you really speak to a point of why I reached out to you for a conference that we hosted back in April, because of your background in counseling and your expressed need to advocate on behalf of these people that have been victimized. And so, you know, let's just start by saying that sexual abuse and child sexual assault is a huge problem in our community and in our state. What has been your experience with this issue since becoming a pastor? Well,
some would say I'm a young pastor now, but when I was even younger, probably 23, 24 years old, I was pastoring a church and had spoken briefly in a sermon. I mean, just a word or two about sexual assault or molestation. And that week I had a knock on my door, and a young lady came and shared her pain and an experience in which she was victimized. And so, you know, as a pastor, you realize when somebody comes to you that this person is not unique. We're all human beings. We all have similar experiences at some point in time. And so I started talking about it more in sermons. As I talked about it more, I had more knocks on my door. And I really, you know, I don't. There's different statistics. I think about women, 1 in 6 or 1 in 4 or whatever, those who have been raped or molested. And the truth was, I was looking around at my small congregation there, and those numbers were playing true. And that was just the people who were actually coming forth and saying. So you know, there's always those who are in hiding and in secrecy have had this happen to them in secrecy as well. So I think that was when I began to really understand how prevalent this was, and not just, this is not just something for people who are not in faith communities or are not in churches. It's throughout the church, and you know, for any pastor that's listening, that there are victims throughout your congregation. You just don't know it. The statistics make that have to be true.
Well, and speaking of just the prevalence of the issue, we have some statistics for the viewers. I'm just going to hit just a few of them. Almost 5 children die every day as a result of child abuse. More than 3 out of 4 are under the age of 4. 90% of child sexual abuse victims know their perpetrator in some way. So if we just stopped right there, 90% know the person who has victimized them in some way. 68% are abused by family members. Those numbers right there, churches are made up of families.
Well, I think one of the things that make churches a very potent place to encounter and be a place of healing for folks who are victims, and for those who are perpetrators. But one of the things that makes it a potent place is just the fact that it is a place where there's the potential in church to open up hearts, to open up your story. Where else in society do we do that? I mean, you go to school to learn, you shop at places, you play sports, but where do you really get vulnerable? Where do you go to, where do you find a place where there's somebody who actually listens and cares and that sorts of things? And then from a sermon standpoint, you know, where you're actually being, hopefully, preach messages that are full of, you know, justice and grace and redemption and hope, and so and beyond that, even in churches we come in contact with people in a very unique way that just makes it very ripe for folks to confide in someone or to speak up about this, where I'm just not sure in society where else that really happens.
Well, and I think my question for you, and where I'd like to sort of begin to guide the conversation, is I agree with you. I think that church becomes that place of vulnerability, connection, relationship, a place of learning, growing spiritually, all important parts to our mental health, our spiritual health, our physical health. And so when folks, and perhaps viewers that are watching, when they are sitting in a church and maybe the crime has been committed at the hands of a spiritual leader, or maybe they are one of these numbers on this sheet that say it's happening in my family, what is it that the church needs to be doing to address the wounds of its people?
I think first thing, you look at a macro view, and that is what kind of culture are we building within an individual church or collective churches together. And the culture of a church, I believe, is mostly set from the preaching ministry. I think that pastors set a tone for the values of a church, for the character of a church, for what's important to a church through preaching. Because if you think about it, it is the most powerful platform that a pastor has, because they're speaking to everybody. Everybody's hearing the same word. If you're in small groups or classes or whatever, they're all hearing different things. So you can really set a macro culture. And so one of the things I would say is preach about it. Preach about this topic. And that doesn't mean you have to do a whole sermon necessarily even on it, or even I preach always in sermon series, so even a whole series. But I think that there are places to interact with this subject along the way. For instance, many of your Old Testament narratives, Old Testament stories, if people think that the Bible is boring, but it actually is full of scandalous sorts of encounters. The Book of Ruth is a great example. You have Ruth, who's a vulnerable woman. There's racial prejudice against her, political prejudice, and then she is by herself in an ancient world with very little power. And you have a guy named Boaz who stands up for her, who tells the men not to touch her. And so it's a perfect place to bring up the topic. And when you do that, I think you set a culture that says we are advocates for the victims. We are confronters to be a voice of justice for those who are perpetrators. And so I've made the comment in preaching before that people, we have a responsibility, especially for children, to report a person, and I've said before, I don't care if it's your dad or your uncle or whoever, because it's that web of silence. So you have you have a culture of advocacy that you're building through there, but also you're breaking the web of silence in a very public arena. And so I think that's where it starts.
Well, and I can say specifically that the first, and this has probably been, Dr. Joyce, a couple of years ago, I actually called your office and left a message for you. Because I heard you, I just happened to be flipping through the television, you came on, and in just as you say, in just a few short sentences, you provided statistics on rape and sexual assault. So my radar went up. And I thought, not only did this pastor provide statistics on rape and sexual assault in his sermon, but he got them right. The stats were right. And so I called you and said, I just want to say, hey, I appreciate that. So in a very practical way, you begin to lay out, just as you
Right.
say, that culture of
Right.
it's okay to talk about this
Well,
here.
I think if you talk about it publicly, and thank you for saying that. I think if you talk about it publicly, and in that arena, expect your phone to ring, because the work is not done once you've done that. You know, basically what you're doing is you're allowing victims to borrow some power and strength from your own power and strength as you speak about it, and maybe they can borrow enough of it to give you a call, to make an appointment, and to come in and to talk about this and begin a road of healing. To be honest with you, I've never had a perpetrator call after this and say, you know what, I've sinned and I've done wrong. But I've had scores and scores of victims who have done that. And that's not to say, I think as you and I have talked previously, that's not to say the church doesn't have a role of perpetrators, because I think it does. We're a place of redemption and transformation and hope. But nonetheless, I think once you break that code of silence, that sort of that web, that partnership web that we've all agreed just not to talk about this.
That's right.
And when you do that, know that there are some people out in your congregation who are just really dying to tell somebody if they're scared half to death, and you may have just given them the green light to be able to do that.
And let's actually, we need to go two ways. So
Yeah.
the first place let's go is let's talk a little bit about maybe the pastor or the church leader who is listening and thinking,
Sure.
I can do that. I
Yeah.
can say this from the pulpit. I can advocate. I can be a voice of justice. I believe in this issue. I believe that it is wrong. It's egregious, and I can do that. It's just the part about the knock on the door or the phone call that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. So could you speak a little bit about what do leaders need to do in
Right.
terms of knowing their limitations and their boundaries, but also their appropriate role?
I think you begin with realizing that anybody who knocks on your door or calls your phone has some fear. They're scared half to death of coming in there. Sometimes coming to the pastor's office feels a little bit like going to the principal's
Going to the
office.
principal's
Okay, I've had people even comment that way, and so I think the first thing is having an environment of empathy, an environment of safety for the person, because not just that they're worried about you're going to reject them. If you have spoken about this publicly, then that probably takes that away quite a bit. But this is retelling this is filled with shame for them, even though they've done nothing wrong. They are the victim of this crime, but there still is that shame. And so the first thing is to be full of compassion and empathy and understanding, and to listen, because we as helping individuals, we tend to want to go to that place of fixing things. And this is not a fixable kind of situation. Right. I guess it's okay to get a little spiritual theological with you, but I think that the ministry of Christ says something about this, because it tells us that the Word, who is Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. And there's power in that dwelling with people in the midst of their tragedies and difficulties. And so I think just being able to be there to hurt with that person and to care for them, I think that's the beginning. That's sort of step one. Step two, then, after empathy, I would say, is empowerment, and is how do we empower them to go on from here. What I have found, in honesty, probably, I'm going to say 80% of the people who come talk to me are talking to me about an issue that happened 15, 20 years ago. And oftentimes there's little hope to do anything legally, although sometimes there still is in those points in times. But which is kind of frightening, because it's as if it takes a series of events to actually get there, I think. But there's this empowerment to begin to see the crime that took place in the other person's actions, and to begin to relieve that person of the shame and the wrongness that they unjustly feel, and to be able to stand with them. I think folks who have been victimized in this way, I think one of the problems is in their mind and their memory, they continue to be victimized. They remember it in such a way. And something has to happen to where a new voice, a new line of thinking comes into play. This isn't just about this happened and now I heal from it, but it happened, and when it happens, people develop beliefs about life and about people and about God and about themselves, and those beliefs start to guide their life. So they need different beliefs. They need a new set of eyes to see this with, and that's how I think we empower, is to begin to see that God hates this, and he hurts with them, and he stands on the sides of the oppressed. And the Bible says that he captures every tear in a bottle and records in a book. He's actually very available and very attentive. And these are things that are often not said, but I think they're empowering beliefs.
I absolutely agree. You know, just from the perspective of a mental health professional, of a advocacy center, I think those two components, empathy and empowerment, are what are most needed oftentimes for victims of this crime. What would you say to pastors and leaders about knowing when it might be time to bring in a mental health professional, maybe when they don't have a counseling background, to make sure this crime this trauma rather gets the attention it needs?
Right. I think that I think that knowing when to refer, knowing how to partner is one of the most important things of pastoral counseling. A pastor does so many different things, and to take on long-term therapy on top of it is a very difficult thing. But we do have partnerships out there. We do have advocacy centers. We do have therapists and other folks. My feeling is that this has happened, it's almost 100% that there needs to be some sort of referral. I'd be hard pressed to see too many situations. If somebody came to me and is telling me the story after they had some advocacy help and some therapy and some things like that, but this is volatile. This is the pain that comes from this is deep, and actually, if somebody's there dismissing that, that's a red flag too. And because one of the coping mechanisms we have to deal with pain is we just simply dismiss it, act like it's not a big deal. And so when somebody's dismissing something that actually feels like a big deal, that's incongruent. So I just think that that this would do good for anybody to, and really what pastors need to have is a referral system already in place before anybody comes together. Can I mention something also about, I mentioned beliefs before and the spiritual part of this. One of the things that I believe that happens is that when trust is broken and somebody is violated in this way, it does affect our beliefs, and it can very well limit our ability to trust, or our spiritual language, or to have faith.
Exactly.
And so what happens is we deem, well, this person was trustworthy, therefore people are trustworthy, or this person was a representative of God, or they were important in my life, therefore God has let me down, God is not trustworthy. And so the capacity to believe, the capacity to have faith is diminished. And oftentimes I found that the person's image of God becomes skewed. They begin to see God as belligerent rather than an advocate, rather than someone who is dismayed about the state of the world and seeking to do something about it. They see God as the one who creates or allows perpetrators. And so I think that's one of the spiritual issues that come up that have to be dealt with.
Well, and I think you hit another key point, and that is that this crime, this experience, does shape the way people view God, their capacity to believe, to trust. And sometimes it's just hearing someone say, that's normal, gives them then the courage to say, well, then maybe I haven't given up on faith. Maybe I haven't given up on God. Maybe this is a natural consequence that I need those new set of eyes.
And the fact they're sitting there listening to your sermon anyway and knocking on your door says that there is a degree of faith and trust in there. What I'll often say is, it looks like you have a lot of courage to show up here and to come and talk to me about this, and tell them how much I appreciate that courage and not underestimate that. It really is, faith. I think about the guy that came to Jesus. He said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And so there is this tension when it comes to faith, and this mixture of faith and doubt. And so, but when somebody has shown the courage to come to you, they're showing a good degree of faith, whether they believe that they can trust somebody or not.
Right. And so let's turn now really to the opposite end of what a pastor is going to maybe encounter that other service providers, helpers, ministers maybe won't. And that is this tension, as you say, between justice and redemption, the offender. What would you say, and we don't have a lot of time, but what would you say to those viewers that have been victimized, that think, I can't go to church. Church excuses or covers up this terrible crime that I have experienced at the hand of someone else, because they're reaching out to that offender. But yet the church's role is to do that. How do you balance that as a pastor?
I think that when we seek transformation of anybody who has sinned or been an offender or perpetrated in some form or fashion, when we seek to do that, it's important to understand that we are, in seeking their transformation, we are also saying that there was something wrong that happened. And so redemption does not excuse what was wrong, it seeks to bring about a greater wholeness. In fact, redemption is a confession that something is torn asunder and that something is broken in the system. So to come alongside of a perpetrator and is to confront them about that and to help them see the negative aspects and to go a different direction with this. And I think that sometimes we think that to help somebody, to care for somebody, to walk with them is to actually affirm what they did, and that's simply not the case. I do think that it's vital that church leaders think about security and think about safety. One of the things we have a responsibility to do is to offer safety for those who are in peril. That's throughout the Bible. I could quote many places where that's spoken, especially orphans and widows and strangers and that sort of thing is mentioned in the Bible. That sort of protection is necessary for us to do. My opinion is that any church that doesn't have some sort of system of security, big or small, because there'll be somebody who will say, well, we're a small church, we don't need that. Small churches, I believe, are just as vulnerable as large churches. So need to think about security, need to talk about this issue with somebody who's doing security. But for me, when I have somebody who's a perpetrator, or when this has ever happened in church, or if it were to happen, then what I would look for as to their future role in the church is, are we seeing them take this seriously? Are we seeing a sense of repentance and a turning away from this, not just in word, but in action? That there are people who have offended in certain ways, and they have taken away their right to ever work with children again, and to ever work with teenagers again, and so they need to be able to respect those boundaries, or they're not really showing that they've taken it seriously.
So what I hear you describing is more of a situation where the leaders, as appropriate, are going to come confront, help, but also make sure that there are mechanisms in place that just because they say or demonstrate that they have repented or have turned away, that then they still may never and are likely to never have access again.
Right. Boundaries have to be set, and to understand that there are certain violations that take things away from you and take them away for good. If you victimize somebody, they can never undo that, but so the perpetrator can never undo that either. And that doesn't mean there's not forgiveness and there's not grace, but it just simply means in the name of safety and in the name of justice, they find some other way to be used of God, and not in ways that give opportunity or even the semblance of the possibility of another infraction to take place. So I think there has to be boundaries, and my opinion is that if you have somebody who is an offender who doesn't respect those boundaries and who doesn't agree to those boundaries, then in reality they've not taken into mind the seriousness of what's happened. And I've seen it where people have taken it seriously, but it's up to the leadership to set those boundaries, to enforce those boundaries, and to say this is the way it's going to be here. God uses us in various ways, and there are ways that people can be used that of God and in ministry that are not going to put them in a place where there's going to be some sort of question about their motives and what might take place.
We just have a few more minutes left, and where I'd like to end today, we've talked about the importance of leadership, setting a culture of safety and acknowledging this crime. We've talked about the courage it would take for victims to approach their pastors, and the importance of knowing when to refer, and you're saying most always get somebody else involved. And then the fact that, yes, churches are often going to have perpetrators that come forward and many that never will come forward. So the importance of safety and security is there. One of the things I'd like for you to end with, I heard you talk about this concept of a voice of justice. Would you talk just for a couple of minutes about what is the role of the pastor of the church in being a voice of justice in the community?
Well, if you think about it, if somebody is oppressed, if somebody has been abused, then someone else has utilized their power to take away that person's voice. Somebody who is raped is saying no, and yet their voice is not heard. And so they come out with the conclusion that their voice doesn't matter, and that they don't have a voice, and there's no power in it. That's true of abuse. It's true of lots of things. It's true in poverty, not just in our country or region, but around the world. When 27,000 children are dying a day around our world to preventable diseases and to malnutrition, they have no voice in it. And so who is taking a stand, and who is saying something about it and doing something about it? And churches have tended to look at sort of personal character sins, and said, well, if you cuss or you drink, or these are the primary sins we look at, but we've not looked at the sins of justice like we should have. And so I think to be able to recognize who is it that is oppressed, and God is an advocate for them, and to be able to speak on their behalf, to make known their plight. And what I have found is when you really do speak in that way, a couple things happen. First of all, those who are oppressed realize that their voice can have power. I think one of the things what advocacy really is somebody who doesn't feel like they have any power, borrowing power from somebody who does. And at least temporarily. I mean, they can't be long term. They have to find the power within themselves to stand and to move forward. But at least temporarily to get them on their feet and to move forward. And so I think that I think that's one of the things that happen. I think the other thing that happens is that when you are a voice of justice, other people who have a voice, other people who have resources, and also have a compassionate heart will also be moved to action in those sorts of situations. And so to me, the gospel and a voice of justice are not contradictory to one another. The good news is that Jesus has a kingdom and He has a reign on the earth, even right now, over His people. But it's a people who look out for the poor and those who are in need, and obviously for us, the lost and those who don't know Christ as well. And so we speak out on their behalf, and we speak out for them and into their lives both.
And on that note, we are going to wrap up today's program. Thank you so much for being here and for being determined and committed to be that voice of justice for our community. It has been a pleasure to get to speak with you today and to get to know you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of the Rays of Hope program. And we challenge you, as always, to be that voice of justice, to get involved and to make a difference in your world. Until next time, we'll see you later.